In order to prevent crisis, it is extremely important to know the triggers of negative behavior to watch for and to understand the possible roots for these triggers. Constant vigilance saves you the time and energy of dealing with crisis and ensures the emotional safety of all of the children you work with. This video reviews some of the common triggers and will also discuss some helpful tips for de-escalating situations of potential crisis. Triggers for negative behavior can stem from both past trauma and from the present situation. Triggers related to past trauma can occur when a child remembers a situation from his or her past that was particularly traumatizing or stress-inducing. Negative behavior might also stem from the unconscious defenses or boundaries that the child puts up as a result of their past experiences. Behavioral triggers may also stem from the tendency of a child who has experienced a traumatic event to exhibit misplaced anger towards authority figures rather than to comply. One example of a past trauma-related trigger came up in my time as a creative writing teacher. As a brainstorming exercise, I had asked my students to close their eyes and think about a significant moment in their life. I asked them to think about the sensory details of that experience, the sights, sounds, smells, touches, tastes. Suddenly, one of my students began sobbing uncontrollably and rushed out of the classroom. The student told me later that the exercise had invoked reliving a very painful memory of her past. The negative behavior that I saw, running out of class without permission, was triggered by that traumatic past event. Just as the past can cause triggers, so can the present. If a child is, say, living in fear of being evicted or has not eaten all day, that child's basic physiological and safety-related needs, think of Maslow's hierarchy, have not been met, and that may result in a negative behavior. Social situations, such as bullying by other children or embarrassment in front of peers, could also trigger a child to act out. Other present situations, such as fear of broken promises, having a bad day, could also trigger negative behaviors. Emotional and behavioral needs can add a whole nother dimension to the way we think about sources triggering negative behavior. These special needs do not exempt children from experiencing past and present traumatic trigger sources. They just add a layer of complexity. The behavioral and emotional challenges listed here are just a sampling of the more common issues that children you work with might be facing. When thinking about these types of needs, I always think back to one particular student of mine who started the year in my classroom with an extensive reputation and history of misbehavior. Crisis situations occurred fairly regularly for her at the beginning of the year, largely due to her severe depression and ODD. Armed with the knowledge of her behavioral challenges, I was able to recognize that when I framed assignments as optional, stating, "I know that you really enjoy writing in your journal. I'd love to hear what you have to say," this student would be much more likely to comply than if I had commanded, "It's journal time. I want to see that pen moving for the next 10 minutes," which was a trigger for a behavioral outburst. Simply recognizing this child's behavioral needs and doing a bit of background research helped me to avoid a crisis situation in my classroom. This example brings us to the process for preventing behavioral crises. As mentioned earlier, knowing what to look for is crucial, and being on the lookout for these behavioral triggers will help you to identify the cause and effect relationships of a child's behavior so that you can adjust your actions accordingly. When a trigger is identified, the next step is de-escalating the situation before it increases to crisis mode. After de-escalation has occurred, it's important to follow up by seeking insight into the triggers. This will help you to adjust your behaviors to better meet the needs of the kids that you work with. At this point, you might be wondering, okay, I know it's important to watch for these signs of emotional escalation, but what is it exactly that I'm watching for? In answer to that question, there are a number of observable signs that showcase that a child is becoming angry or uncomfortable. Clenched fists, a reddened or whitening face, tightened lips or clenched teeth, and a change in the tone and volume of a child's voice are all physical signs that a crisis might be coming. As soon as you've observed an escalating crisis, it's important to begin to de-escalate. The strategy you use will be correlated to the needs of that child. These needs fall into two categories: the need to connect and the need to retreat. Typically, you can determine the needs of a child by simply asking the question, "Will you tell me what's bothering you?" If a child responds by talking to you about the situation or seems to want to talk, then the child is likely experiencing the need to connect. However, if the child distances herself from you with a negative or confrontational response, the child likely needs to retreat. De-escalating children who need to connect means truly getting to the heart of the problem. The child may need to be heard and empowered, or they may need to have a basic need met, such as taking a nap or having a snack. They might also just need the space to vent about their frustration. In order to provide this connection, first listen thoughtfully to the child's frustration, asking pertinent follow-up questions that really make the child feel heard. Next, empathize with the child and validate their point of view. If that child is being excluded by their peers, for example, you might say, "It sounds like the other kids aren't being very nice to you. That must make you feel really sad and angry. I think it makes sense that you're feeling this way." After empathizing, share your own thoughts and feelings with the child. For the example of the child being excluded, this might include sharing how sad it makes you feel that the child feels this way. And you might also share observations with the child about the interactions you've seen between them and the other kids. After you've taken the time to fully understand the child's point of view, you will likely be able to identify the underlying need of that child, and you can work together with that child to come up with a plan to address that need. For the excluded child, this might include meeting a new group of friends or changing a seat. De-escalating children who need to retreat takes a very different approach. These children oftentimes are looking to process their feelings and needs in a safe environment. In order to enable this to happen, make sure to be directive and tell that child exactly when and how to separate herself from the situation. Examples of this type of direction are statements like, "I'd like you to have some quiet time now. Please sit on the magic couch, and I'll come over in a few minutes to see how you're doing." And, you seem to need a break. Please go to the drawing circle and color for a few minutes." Make sure to ensure that during this quiet time, the child is in a safe and uninterrupted space. Additionally, assign a constructive way for the child to process their feelings based on how you know the child. If you know that that child enjoys drawing, you can assign them that task so they can reflect on the situation through art. After a few minutes, make sure to check up on the child. Oftentimes, that check-in results in recognizing the need to connect, and you can revert to that de-escalation process. Remember that this space should not feel like a punishment, so make sure your tone and gestures convey that. After you've successfully de-escalated the child and avoided a crisis, it's important to double back and discuss the situation. This technique ensures reflection for both you and the child, but the conversation can only take place when the child is fully calmed down and is ready to begin the reflection process. Like you did in the de-escalation stage, make sure to empathize with the child's feelings and to validate their trigger. But also, focus on an action plan for when these situations occur in the future. Independently from the child, start thinking about other instances where the child was triggered and look for patterns. The action planning process should extend to both parents and teachers, who could provide very valuable insights and best practices for avoiding and de-escalating the triggers of this particular child. When having conversations meant to build the child's self-awareness, have them think back to the very moment that they began to feel triggered. Ask questions like, "What did it feel like in your body?" And "What can you watch for next time?" Those questions will allow the child to start recognizing their own triggers and to take measures to self-regulate. The conversation should also focus on measures that the child can take to deal with the trigger, such as asking for space or isolating proactive solutions for calming themselves down. Now that we've explored both triggers and the de-escalation process, Take a look at some of the resources in order for you to apply this to your own practice.